The Americans want to give South Africa two fingers and tell us where to stick it, but they can't, because if they do, we're going to run off to the commies.
You are exactly right. So mainstream media in South Africa is blasting all over the place that AGOA might be cancelled, South Africa will lose out. That couldn't be further from the truth. A letter was received by Blinken, who is the Secretary of State of America, and was signed by a guy called Christopher Coons. And Byron, I don't know if you read the letter, but if you have, it basically says, we don't feel like having the AGOA conference in South Africa, but rather have it in Botswana. Now, I'm sorry, that doesn't say we can't sing AGOA.
No, it doesn't. What it basically says, the letter itself, says that South Africa, because of its close trade ties with the Russians, and to a degree the Chinese, they don't feel that it would serve the American order very well for them to then host the AGOA conference. Because obviously the deal of the AGOA conference would be like, look how well we're doing with the US. But South Africa can't say that, because it doesn't have good relationships at the moment with the US. So what they're saying is, let us move it to a different country that has better relations with the US, like Botswana, and we can continue to have the discussions there. It's purely optics, Ramon. It's nothing more than optics.
Very much so. And if you read the letter very carefully, it says we're quite happy to sign or renew AGOA earlier than expected. So the renewal date is 2025, but I think they might want to do it before next year's election, before Trump comes into power. Because Trump, I think, will take a far more direct course of action against South Africa in this particular regard. So there's no way in hell America is cancelling AGOA if they are saying we want to bring the renewal date closer than before.
Yeah, so this actually becomes more problematic for the Americans because effectively it depends who you speak to in Congress and who you speak to in terms of the American forces. But there is a general acceptance, especially in the Democrat Party, that the future of the global order will end up being decided in sub-Saharan Africa. Why? Because we actually have some of the largest quantities of minerals and resources on the globe. Now, should Trump come in with his MAGA republic, the idea will ultimately be make America great again. The only way to make America great again is to basically re-centralize all of your resources in your industry and the American nation, which means that they're not really that bothered about foreign forces. They're not worried about foreign interests. If that happens, then basically it will be Trumpian policy all over again, which is who gives a shit what happens in sub-Saharan Africa. It's not America. What's it got to do with me? So what it appears to be is that the Democrats want to secure up the future of sub-Saharan Africa before they leave power. And then when Trump gets in office, he can do, well, what Trump does.
If AGOA is cancelled in terms of South Africa, the rand goes to shit, and basically the country is ripe for Russia and China to take over it in terms of funding, in terms of paying social grants, in terms of building nuclear reactors. There will be no other choice for South Africa but to be a vassal state of Russia and China if AGOA is cancelled. The Americans know this. The Americans don't want it, and therefore AGOA is not going to be cancelled. More importantly, the letter that we saw that was published in the news was signed by a guy called Chris Coons. If you know Chris Coons, you know that he is the most ardent lefty Democrat bastard around. That guy loves the ANC. He doesn't hate it, he absolutely loves it.
AGOA only contributes to 8% of GDP when it comes to South Africa. The extra tariffs on our exports potentially could ruin a GDP deficit or provide us with a GDP deficit of, say, 6%. That is not enough to bankrupt South Africa. However, what it is enough to do is basically spook any terms of investor. As we saw when discussions abounded about potential sanctions, the rand tanked to absolutely nothing, and nobody showed any real interest in South African bonds. So what this effectively means is that foreign investors will desert South Africa. The rand will crash. With the rand crashing, we'll have forms of hyperinflation. Hyperinflation ultimately mean to the government not being able to borrow money. When the government can't borrow money, it can't pay grants. Grants lead to riots. Riots lead to infrastructure being damaged. What it will ultimately mean is that there will be nothing left in South Africa worth stealing because it will have all been burnt down. The ANC will need to rebuild, and they're going to need to go to people that can rebuild for it. Russia and China will step in to build things, and what they usually do, and as we've seen in the rest of Africa, they will build those things and they will tie the cost of them to mineral resource extraction. If the Russians and the Chinese are extracting South African minerals, the Americans can't, because you can't extract the same resources twice. So one person's getting the deal. It's either going to the Eastern Bloc or the Western Bloc. And this is the dilemma that the Americans are facing.
And that's essentially the key, right? Ironically, in a sort of multipolar world, South Africa becomes, as we said on this program, much more important to both America and to Russia and China. The Americans cannot afford to lose the South Atlantic corridor. They can't afford for the Chinese to build a base in Simonstown that is only, a day or 2 or 3 sailing from New York City. The Americans can't afford to let that happen. And AGOA is a key control mechanism to ensure that South Africa doesn't really go full into de-dollarization and to BRICS in general. So I think AGOA will stay. It is a carrot at the end of the stick for South Africa to be neutral in this conflict between Ukraine and Russia. And therefore, it's in the interest of America to make sure AGOA continues, and South Africa is a key part of that continuation. And they want to do it before Trump comes in and sort of upends everything and ends the war.
Yes, and I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is a key component that you really do need to understand. When Donald Trump gets into office, he will probably end this war very swiftly, because Trumpian policies are very difficult to negotiate with. Either do what I say, or I nuke you back to the Stone Age. Let's face it, very few people are going to argue with that. With that being said, the Chinese and the Russians are facing a difficult dilemma too, because the war and the political instability in the region has allowed them to realign the global order. That realignment will be called into question the minute Trump takes office. So, effectively, the Chinese and the Russians are on the clock, and they need to move quickly, which is probably why Vladimir Putin has outmaneuvered the ANC at every single turn with the whole AGOA debacle.
Absolutely. The Russians and the Chinese want nothing more than for AGOA to be cancelled. The Americans know that, and they won't let it happen. And for more on this topic, why not check out this video right here.